Pablo Escobar, one of the most famous narcos in history, as famous for the extent of his wealth and crime as he is for the Robin Hood ideals he followed in giving money back to the poorest Colombians. Netflix Narcos covered Escobar's reign to universal plaudits. But did they tell you everything? Welcome to Bizarre History. Today we're looking at everything about Pablo Escobar that Netflix is hiding from you. Sometimes enough is enough, and well, too much is too much. Though the extent will be covered later, Pablo Escobar made a lot of money. The Netflix show covers this extensively, to be fair, but maybe not quite near enough. Lavish, expenditure, and life of crime have a long-standing double act, covered across media for decades. Being the producer of 80% of America's cocaine at its production prime meant an ungodly level of expense that led to, well, near godly results. As one is to do when equipped with more money than several countries have, one gets to spending. Pablo Escobar, on a 5,000-acre estate of his, decided to construct a zoo. As you might have guessed, with no expense spared, Pablo only wanted the best. For his own zoo, Pablo Escobar acquired ostriches, antelope, giraffes, and even hippos. The 4 hippos imported gained a degree of notoriety in Colombia and were soon known as the cocaine hippos. Their story didn't end in a drug lord zoo, however. It's understood the difficulty in seizing them meant that they were just neglected to wander around the abandoned estate. After long enough, they escaped and soon found a home downriver and began breeding. Come decades later, Don Pablo Escobar is responsible for starting the largest hippo population on Earth outside of Africa. You see, one summer internship with Greenpeace and his whole life could have turned out different. The incredible performance of Wagner Moura gave producers more than enough room to work the power of Escobar's personality as a way to show power and intimidation. A lot of this is absolutely key to understanding the depth of his power. Viewers are shown Pablo knowing military and police personnel's loved ones' names for good reason. He could and did. What's less shown and used with restraint is Pablo's own indulgence in violence firsthand. Quite possibly due to scope and storytelling convenience, Pablo is shown delegating more than actively dishing out violence. The purpose of showing this can be debated, but this was a man described as suffering a gratuitous cruelty. Informants have reported that Escobar was not afraid to drill holes in people's kneecaps, should they prove an obstacle to his intentions and plans. Netflix portrait of Pablo Escobar shows an extensive use of human mules to run drugs. This apparently neglects Escobar's desire to have pills sewn into animals as a means of drug mule. Upon hearing a waiter being accused of trying to steal silverware at a function he was attending, Escobar organized to have the waiter dumped in a nearby pool with his hands duct taped together, leaving the man to drown. This was not the only murderous tale attributed to Pablo firsthand. It's believed all the architects of all his over 150 built homes were murdered by Escobar as a means of keeping the secrets of the homes buried. I'm sure that wasn't what they planned for. Netflix's success with Narcos is in the abilities of the storytellers as much as the jaw-dropping real-life material. Like many a life of crime story, Narcos does include the trope of constantly dropping images of cozy, aspirational domestic life in its portrait of Don Pablo Escobar. While there are accounts from Escobar's own children of a father that loved them, it is only until the authorities began closing in that we get any real sense of the domestic upheaval in the house of Escobar. There are accounts that Escobar's retaliation across Colombia against the authorities were pleaded against by his own family. This no less the case when a failed assassination attempt on Pablo left his daughter deaf in one ear. The dynamics in a portrait of the family is simplified in having the children portrayed as much younger than they were in reality. Come Escobar's death in 1997, his son Sebastian was in fact 16 and not an infant. His account of his father is a man so unable to take a loss that he would cheat against his own children when playing the games with them. Perhaps the most fascinating detail was his own brother being fictionalized out of Narcos' portrayal. Roberto Escobar was in fact Pablo's accountant through his rule as the world's first narco-terrorist. Even more curiously, he faces accusations to this day of being a DEA informant who was responsible for Pablo's downfall. Oh, brother. A small but significant detail of Netflix's portrayal of Escobar's time was its portrait of guerrilla group M19. If anything, they're portrayed as a somewhat lackluster and impotent force. This is not the case in reality. In the 1980s and leading up to it, M19 were armed revolutionaries capable of kidnap and murder of significant figures, raids on embassies, and politically sensitive settings, as well as the Netflix-covered theft of national treasure. Their leader at the time, Ivan Marina Ospina, was nicknamed Ivan the Terrible, and not for his breath or lack of table manners. M19 in the decades that followed went on to civilize and join national politics. To be sure, Narcos is not the story of M19, and they only play a strand in the story of the Medellin cartel. Yet their portrayal as a ragtag group of wannabes doesn't quite hold up in the light of reality. Making them smaller to make Pablo look even bigger? Maybe. Avoiding the politically awkward given M19's re-innovation in the years that followed? Quite possibly. The finishing of Pablo Escobar's story in Narcos involves him finally facing the full wrath of the authorities, and then shooting him several times during an attempted rooftop escape. This exact end is disputed by Pablo Escobar's closest, his family. His son has given interviews expressing that he was implicitly told by his father that phones were death. Pablo Escobar was under no delusions about his telephone lines being monitored by intelligence agencies and police, yet his son Sebastian claims his father phoned his family 7 times the day of his seizure and capture. This was done with full knowledge his calls would be triangulated. Furthermore, all day after his birthday, there is dispute as to whether the final shot that killed Pablo Escobar was fired by police. Relatives have consistently claimed that Pablo's death was suicide. His son states his father taught him the way to commit suicide was a gunshot above the right ear and not in the mouth. His brother Roberto has also made the repeated claim a cornered Pablo has always stated he would shoot himself through the ear if in a corner he couldn't escape. The autopsy of Pablo Escobar showed 3 gunshot wounds, 1 in his torso, 1 in the leg, and a final fatal wound above the right ear. So did they really get him, or did Pablo go out in the way Pablo wanted? Considering the violence, profiting on misery and incredible costs of his enterprise, Pablo Escobar is still a figure of fascination and idolatry to this day. What is harder to grasp in something so culturally soaked as his name and its notoriety is that Pablo Escobar was the very first of his kind. He was the legitimate first narco-terrorist, one able to bend and outspend an entire country to his will and wanting. Look no further than Netflix coverage of Escobar's self-made prison in the Medellin's La Catedral. People capable of acts of domestic terror with control of huge supply lines of profit, literally dwarfing countries, were a force unheard of. He was and is to this day literally the wealthiest criminal in recorded history. His brother's memoir shed some light on the reality of one enterprise and ultimately person incurring that much money. Escobar would be in for such ludicrous, mind-bending amounts of hard cash. The Medellin spent $2,500 a month in rubber bands just for making rolls of the stuff. As if spending money just to keep money wasn't curious enough, Roberto claims 10% of everything the Medellin cartel took in was written off due to the impossibility of storing it all. Better write off 10% than find it soaked, rotten, or rat-eaten when you need it. In 1987, Escobar's net worth was ranked at $2 billion, which was such a significant sum he made Forbes' richest people list. So much money, in fact, he stayed on the list for another 7 years. This in spite of his death being predicted by the publication itself and no less than 3 federal indictments during his tenure. Colombian governments to this day have recovered over $100 million of Medellin cartel money buried and hidden: cash, gold, guns. The search for more is ongoing, and its endpoint can't be seen or known. Thank you for watching Bizarre History. If you want more from the underside of the past and its pioneers, feel free to subscribe, like, and hit that notification bell. See you next time.